Welcome to episode 1 of The Delve, the show which asks and attempts to answer what the hell is going on. I'm Spate, and today's topic is a slightly academic one. I'm going to have a look at poetry as a state of becoming through the lens of the critic and essayist William Hazlitt, who is often associated with the Romantic poets such as Coleridge, Keats, Wordsworth. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how he rewrites the concept of poetry, what he's getting at, and what that means in terms of human experience and existence. And I'll be referring to some of my old essays, to Haslitt's text on poetry in general, which you can find online, and maybe touch on some poetry or creative critical writing. I've got some books here, so I might go into those a little bit. It's worth noting that I'm not an expert in really anything at all, and expertise is really beyond my nature. So the subjects in the Delve are meant to be a brief infatuation with and investigations into a topic. And as a result, I'm bound to get lots of things wrong, to oversimplify things, and to miss out problematic details. I beg for your forgiveness in advance. So, who's William Hazlitt? Like I said, he's a critic and essayist. Wikipedia says that he is an English essayist, drama and literary critic, painter, social commentator, and philosopher. He's now considered one of the greatest critics and essayists in the history of the English language, placed in the company of Samuel Johnson and George Orwell. He is also acknowledged as the finest art critic of his age. Despite his high standing among historians of literature and art, his work is currently little read and mostly out of print. And I encountered him actually through, I did a module in university about Romanticism, and he was introduced as like a secondary text. And the way that he writes about poetry is really interesting, and I wrote a piece of writing about him and that piece of writing. So the text that I'm mainly concerned with is called On Poetry in General. And it starts out basically by recasting poetry. So he says, the best general notion which I can give of poetry, that it is the natural impression of any object or event by its vividness, exciting and involuntary movement of imagination and passion, and producing by sympathy a certain modulation of the voice or sounds expressing it. So he goes on in some length. I'll cover a couple of the sections that I find really interesting. One of them is on the first page and one of them is on the 7th. But bearing in mind that the pages might not be exactly how they were in first print. So he says, poetry is the language of the imagination and the passions. It relates to whatever gives immediate pleasure or pain to the human mind. It comes home to the bosoms and businesses of men, for nothing but what so comes home to them in the most general and intelligible shape can be the subject for poetry. Poetry is the universal language which the heart holds with nature and itself. He who has a contempt for poetry cannot have much respect for himself or for anything else. It's not a mere frivolous accomplishment, as some persons have been led to imagine, the trifling amusement of a few idle readers or leisure hours. It has been the study and delight of mankind in all ages. Many people suppose that poetry is something to be found only in books, contained in lines of 10 syllables with like endings. But wherever there is a sense of beauty, or power, or harmony, as in the motion of a wave of the sea, in the growth of a flower that spreads its sweet leaves to the air and dedicates its beauty to the sun, there is poetry in its birth. If history is a grave study, poetry may be said to be a graver. Its materials lie deeper and are spread wider. History treats for the most part of the cumbrous and unwieldy masses of things, the empty cases in which the affairs of the world are packed, under the heads of intrigue or war, in different states and from century to century, but there is no thought or feeling that can have entered into the mind of man which he would be eager to communicate to others, or which they would listen to with delight, that is not a fit subject for poetry. It is not a branch of authorship. It is the stuff of which our life is made. The rest is mere oblivion, a dead letter. For all that is worth remembering in life is the poetry of it. Fear is poetry. Hope is poetry. Love is poetry. Hatred is poetry. Contempt, jealousy, remorse, admiration, wonder, pity, despair, or madness are all poetry. Poetry is that fine particle within us that expands, rarefies, refines, raises our whole being. Without it, man's life is poor as beasts. Man is a poetical animal, and those of us who do not study the principles of poetry act upon them all our lives. Like Molière's bourgeois gentilhomme, who had always spoken prose without knowing it. The child is a poet, in fact, when he first plays at hide-and-seek or repeats the story of Jack the Giant Killer. The shepherd boy is a poet when he first crowns his mistress with the garland of flowers, the countryman when he stops to look at the rainbow, the city apprentice when he gazes after the Lord Mayor's show, the miser when he hugs his gold, the courtier who builds his hopes upon a smile, the savage who paints his idol with blood, the slave who worships a tyrant, or the tyrant who fancies himself a god, the vain, the ambitious, the proud, the choleric man, the hero, and the coward, the beggar and the king, the rich and the poor, the young and the old, all live in a world of their own making. And the poet does no more than describe what all the others think and act. All right. So that's probably quite a different way of thinking about poetry than the way people would have thought about it previously, which is mainly a skill, almost a song, a spoken song. It's quite a radical idea, I think, at the time. He goes on to talk about poetry and uses a sort of interesting metaphor. Poetry is in all its shapes the language of the imagination and the passions, of fancy and will. Nothing, therefore, can be more absurd than the outcry which has been sometimes raised by frigid and pedantic critics for reducing the language of poetry to the standard of common sense and reason. For the end and use of poetry, both at the first and now, was and is to hold the mirror up to nature, seen through the medium of passion and imagination, not divested of that medium by means of literal truth or abstract reason. The painter of history might as well be required to represent the face of a person who has just trod upon a serpent with the still life expression of a common portrait, as the poet to describe the most striking and vivid impressions which things can be supposed to make upon the mind in the language of common conversation. Let who will strip nature of the colors and shapes of fancy. The poet is not bound to do so. The impressions of common sense and strong imagination, that is, of passion and indifference, cannot be the same, and they must have a separate language to do justice to either. Objects must strike differently upon the mind, independently of what they are in themselves, as long as we have a different interest in them, as we see them in a different point of view, nearer or at a greater distance, morally or physically speaking, from novelty, from old acquaintance, from our ignorance of them, from our fear of their consequences, from contrast, from unexpected likeness. We can no more take away the faculty of the imagination than we can see all objects without light or shade. Some things must dazzle us by their preternatural light. Others must hold us in suspense and tempt our curiosity to explore their obscurity. Those who would dispel these various illusions to give us their drab-colored creation in their stead are not very wise. Let the naturalist, if he will, catch the glowworm, carry it home with him in a box, and find it next morning nothing but a little gray worm. Let the poet or the lover of poetry visit it at evening, when beneath the scented hawthorn and the crescent moon it has built itself a palace of emerald light. So he's kind of railing against scientific language and the kind of people who break things down and interpret things and tear everything apart in order to explain. He's talking about experience versus like a sort of pedantic understanding. So I had to do an essay on this piece of writing, and I'll read some of that. And when I read him, and when I read the Romantic poets, I started thinking about, weirdly, a connection between them and Eastern philosophers. Um, it's a very different, like, starting point, but I'll try to link it together here so you can understand. So, the whole piece on poetry in general, it's quite a complex piece of persuasive writing. So he's trying to radically alter the perceptions of the reader about the nature of poetry. Through his argument, poetry becomes something other than mere written or performed creative work. So for him, poetry is the innate language of interiority, so what's inside of our minds. And to write it down or read it out is just to articulate its pre-existence within the human experience. So I'm going to try to grapple with poetry as a state of becoming and demonstrate the ways in which he kind of defends this characterization of poetry, but also actually performs this characterization. He writes it into reality as his argument kind of unfolds. So the first part of the essay on poetry in general is he does this kind of bold thing of separating the subject matter of poetry from the forms of expression to which it gives birth. So the traditional idea of poetry as a written and spoken work is sort of subverted through this piece of writing, and its status is kind of up in the air. Like, he's reframing poetry as something completely different from what it would have been understood as before. His conception of poetry almost seems to reach toward a monistic spiritual state, made up of the involuntary movement of imagination and passion. And what I say when I say what I mean when I say monistic is essentially a conception of the world where the spiritual world and the physical world are united; they're one thing, as opposed to dualism of Christianity, where there's a physical world and then a spiritual world which is separate to that physical world. So you've got the like the bodily and like the holy, different worlds, and you only gain entrance to one through the almost not enjoying the other, right? In a lot of like Christian texts. So each experience of the external, in the way that Hazlitt frames this, it's like a brightly colored raindrop sort of falling into the darkened sea of the human mind. As it merges with the whole, it illuminates waves of the mind and shimmers in reflection against loaded signifiers, emotion, individual experience. So he writes that, quote, the light of poetry is not only a direct, but also a reflected light, that while it shows us the object, throws a sparkling radiance on all around it. The flame of the passions communicated to the imagination reveals to us, as with a flash of lightning, the inmost recesses of thought, and penetrates our whole being. It's in this penetration that the external is internalized. So we take the things we experience externally through our senses, and they're ingested into our minds. The imagination, quote, represents objects that as they are in them, not as they are in themselves, but as they are molded by other thoughts and feelings into an infinite variety of shapes and combinations of power, end quote. So there's another critic called Pollen who describes this as a sense of merging within Hazlitt's use of memory and his quotations. And he says, quote, the idea of meltdown, hot liquid, metal, or glass forms the basis, if basis is the correct term, of Hazlitt's critical imagination, rather like Cellini throwing blocks of copper, bronze scraps, and lumps of pewter into a furnace. Memory feeds quotations from a wide range of authors into his imagination, where they're melted down before emerging as literally a finished article. So Hazlitt uses quotations, and they sort of act as literary evidence for his argument. But the way that he uses them equally illustrates his ideas of poetry. So the texts, having been consumed by him or ingested into his mind, or having penetrated into his mind, they behave in exactly the way he claims that poetry does. They sort of resonate against his existing ideas, melt into place within his mind, and enhance and hone his ideas about poetry. When they're used within his essay, they become an extension of his imagination, while somehow managing to resist complete abstraction from their original contexts. So Shakespeare's King Lear in the essay remains King Lear, but is now forged anew in the submarine pressures of Hazlitt's mind sea, shaped and interpreted by the waves around it, eventually to emerge in order to illustrate a point about the sublime. And when we talk about the sublime, what we mean is it's basically a term used a lot in Romanticism. It refers to greatness, external greatness. So you, for example, see mountains or an incredible landscape. The experience of it is almost incomprehensible to us. And the mind does this thing where it sort of grapples with the experience. We're almost unable to take that in because the experience is too grand. It's on too great of a scale. And that's a lot of what Romanticism is grappling with. It's like these sort of experiences of the sublime. And there are different conceptions of the sublime. There's a sort of positive sublime in which you're able to kind of, it's a good experience. You're able to sort of feel happiness or some sense of a good experience. And then there's a negative sublime in which the mind keeps encountering this thing, can't deal with it, and it sort of generates sort of a fearful awe that continues. So the process could be an example of the positive sublime. So, and what I mean by this is the way in which the way in which the external text, which gives him emotions and incites his imagination, is then confronted and internalized by the linguistic capability of his mind. So this issue around the sublime makes up a very complex, important portion of his defense of his characterization of poetry. So if poetry is truly, quote, the stuff of which our life is made, which is what he calls it, how can something so seemingly commonplace also fit another critic's claim, Bacon, that it also, quote, raises the mind and hurries it into sublimity. So Hazlitt's fine particle lies within humanity at the same moment that it, quote, expands, rarefies, refines, raises our whole being. And this suggests that the natural state is one of continuing elevation. So as we experience things, our mind ingests them and it changes our interiority. And Hazlitt's idea about this is that process is poetry, that the actual experience is poetry. So Hazlitt points to poetry in quite a big range of figures, both high and low in social hierarchy. So the beggar and the savage are equally possessing of poetic nature as a king or a courtier. And this suggests that poetry is actually quite egalitarian for Hazlitt. And he calls it, quote, the universal nature which the heart holds with nature and itself, end quote. not only does poetry occur in everyone, but it's also not limited to the realms of the seemly or the beautiful, despite occupying those spaces deftly as well. So there's another quote. There is no thought or feeling that can have entered into the mind of man which he would be eager to communicate to others, or which they would listen to with delight, that is not a fit subject for poetry. So everything essentially is a fit subject for poetry. So that seems to strike at the heart of the question about his characterization of poetry, and it does so in sort of the terms of the sublime. His ideas about poetry seem to place it at a point at which the external meets the internal. And this is exactly where we would meet the sublime. So he's essentially reframing poetry itself as the sublime. When Hazlitt writes that poetry signifies the excess of the imagination beyond the actual or ordinary impression of any object or feeling, you could easily draw comparisons to something Keats wrote, calling it a fine excess of emotion. But in the case of Hazlitt, poetry is what occurs in our minds at that moment when imagination and emotion encounter the external. So whether the result is positive or negative sublime, it's not really that important of a concern to him. He seems to cover both in his essay, but if we look to the terms of the way he frames it, we can see that some of the ways in which this fine return of the passion may manifest itself. For example, if we look to fear, we can link this pretty straightforwardly to the negative sublime. A mind encounters something external and unknowable, and it can't internalize the object or the idea, and it struggles with it again and again and again, and that causes fear or dread. For Edmund Burke, this results in the sublime. And for Hazlitt, the sublime is poetry. So in a sense, poetry becomes an act or a state of existence. And poets are only the scribes of that sort of universal experience. So in this way of imagining it, fear is poetry, and so are all the other emotions that Hazlitt equates it to, because they all rely on an external other, whether that's a single person, a society, an idea, an object, whatever. And the method of internalization at the extent to which that method is successful determines the category of the sublime and the type of emotion that it evokes. So it's that emotion that sets Hazlitt's conception of poetry apart from other types of writing, such as history. So he's very deeply invested in this experience of poetry as a viable reality. So he says, if poetry is a dream, the business of life is much the same. If it is a fiction made up of what we wish things to be and fancy that they are, because we wish them so, there is no other nor better reality. So there's something in that speaks to a kind of creation of reality itself. The essay, in some ways, tries to embark upon an act of creating poetry anew. And then I make a reference here in my essay to Blake, who took dialectical oppositions of innocence and experience into a kind of uncarved block of childhood in some of his poetry. Hazlitt's writing is concerned with subjectivity and with the viability of sort of multifaceted images of humanity. So one part of the history of the human mind, which he says, that's a quote, the presence of emotion within this poetic version of history is precisely the point, and it tells a necessary story about the inextricability of imagination from the human experience. So, quote, we can no more take away the faculty of the imagination than we can see all objects without light or shade, end quote. So his argument is sort of hinged on the idea that to lose emotion and imagination, those are the things that give birth to the moment of poetry. So to lose it would be to lose part of humanity. And so there's some sense that he's sort of speaking to an audience that is increasingly influenced by science, which isn't itself a bad thing, but he's trying to safeguard a place for poetry within society. So he says, society by degrees is constructed into a machine that carries us safely and insipidly from one end of life to the other in a very comfortable prose style. So I think he's talking about sort of more utilitarian, scientific, materialistic way of thinking. And he's sort of trying to avoid this insipid prose state. Quote, one appearance that the glowworm presents, end quote, is the poetic one. And that's tied to emotion and imagination. But he's not proposing that the appearance is an alternative to the one of the naturalist. He just seems to be suggesting that the poetic view of the world can stand alongside science and history and philosophy and is sort of an equally important type of thread in a big tapestry of existence. So he also addresses change in his text. If his conception of poetry seems to approach monistic thinking in that it's embracing the sublime and thus is a kind of melting of subjectivity, which, quote, brings every moment of our being or object of nature in startling review before us, end quote. It is also a conception which seems to be dialectical in nature, in its attention to change. Hazlitt suggests, quote, poetry represents forms chiefly as they suggest other forms, feelings as they suggest forms or other feelings. Poetry puts a spirit of life and motion into the universe. It describes the flowing, not the fixed, end quote. So I think why he's concerned with the living glowworm, with this sort of emerald area that it creates, and the glowing rather than the gray, dead glowworm. So the living glowworm rather than a specimen. It kind of explains something about his characterization of poetry. If poetry is a universal language that is sort of innate and egalitarian, it's equal grounds for anyone. It's an egalitarian force within humanity. If this force is a kind of act of becoming, in the sense that it's actuated by the attempts to internalize the external, and then encounters the forces of imagination and emotion, then it can be understood in terms of a complex dialectic between the subject and the object. So just let me explain dialectic for a second. So there's different forms of dialectic or different conceptions of what dialectic is, but so you have like Hegelian dialectic, which is essentially you have two opposing forces and then a synthesis happens between them. If you think about the yin yang, that's sort of dialectic, and that's sort of a more Eastern concept of what dialectic is. So when I mean dialectic, what I mean is it's not simple binary oppositions. For example, if there's darkness and light, right? Yes, there are two binary opposites, but they're actually inextricable from one another. So you cannot have a conception of what darkness is without a conception of light. You can't. There's no way of understanding those two without them being part of the same whole. So while there are oppositions, they're tied together. They're actually one thing rather than two separate things. Now, there are different ways of looking dialectic, like I said. So this is what I mean when I'm talking about this in particular. So I'm taking dialectic and then monism, which we already discussed, and then I'm putting them together into dialectical monism. Okay. So if we see this as a dialectical monism, so a single world in which the spiritual world is the same as the physical world, but which we necessarily see dualism in, but that dualism itself is made up of oppositions that are inextricable from one another and defined by one another, then we're faced with a world in which all subjectivity melts away and all ideas, all physicality, all signifiers and signified, all emotions, every single thing in existence is just a separate ripple in a vast monistic sea. In this sea, each single human subjectivity acts on and is acted upon by the other waves it encounters, and each time this occurs, we could call it poetry. We're following Hazlitt's suggestion, everything experienced by humanity in this worldview is poetry. The reason for this is that for Hazlitt, the essence of humanity is the essence of poetry. And if you remove the things that make us uniquely human, like emotion and imagination, and not just mechanisms of flesh, biological organisms, we then lose that essence of humanity. So in that way, we can sort of use the image of dialectical monism for the purposes of conceptualization, while still acknowledging that the subjectivity is a necessary component of Hazlitt's characterization of poetry, because it does rely on built-up emotional, intellectual, imaginative connections within each mind. Each individual person will encounter the external in a different manner, and encountering different, like, you sort of then move to a different metaphor, like a big web. So each person is going to encounter the external with different twitches in the sort of web-like all of the mind, right? So the changing nature of this poetry means that fear might be the result of a single encounter, or hatred the next. It also means that while each individual's experience may be different, there's a kind of unity in this state of being separate. And we can still imagine that unity as a monistic sea. So it houses lots of different human subjectivities and external forces, and each individual wave is a separate wave, but you can't separate that wave from the sea for obvious reasons. So this links into Eastern philosophy, and particularly the Eastern philosophy as introduced or explained by Alan Watts, who said that the universe peoples like the sea waves, right? So yes, each one of us is separate, but we are made up of our connections with the earth, with each other. There's no, the separateness is essentially an illusion. We are part of big systems, and those systems are part of bigger systems. And essentially, you can then tie into something that I asked Hannah about yesterday, which is the Spinoza's God, the concept that that if there is a God, that God is essentially made up of the entirety of everything, right? So, so then we can see that Hazlitt's on poetry in general is very complex. It doesn't follow the existing ideas about poetry. So he's trying to redraft poetry as an innate human experience. And he's grasping for a way to reserve space for poetic imagination and emotion in a society that's moving increasingly towards mechanization, scientific conceptions of reality. And it relies, this defense sort of relies on his redirection of the poetry signifier to a new kind of signified poetry that is internal rather than external. The extent to which this idea is internalized by the reader depends on whether we agree with his assertion that language is, quote, a thing altogether arbitrary and conventional, and whether this new poetry melts seamlessly into the sea of our minds, or was rejected and feared, producing the negative sublime. So that's like the end of the essay, what the essay covered. But I think it's really interesting to think about how that might be true, right? If we think of poetry as a thing that was under threat then, it's even more under threat now, right? And what I mean by that is not that poetry as an experience is under threat. It's poetry as a language, as something written down. It's not valued in the same way. So we haven't lost poetry as an experience if we accept his recasting of poetry as as an experiential one, as one that is essentially the sublime. Our way of experiencing the world is poetry. We haven't lost that, but what we have lost to a pretty large extent is the scribes of poetry. Now, I have lots of friends that are poets, but I think probably most people don't have lots of friends that are poets. And I find it sad that poetry is like sort of denigrated now, even in publishing. No one really takes it very seriously because in order to be a published poet doesn't necessarily mean you're successful. Success is measured in a different way. You're a successful poet, but that no longer means a successful career or as a way of making a living or any of those sorts of things. So I just wanted to read a couple of things. One of them is there is a book by Mark Doty called Still Life with Oysters and Lemon. Great book. It's a piece of creative critical writing. Very great writer. But it talks about this sort of experience. Essentially encountering something that generates awe or emotion, evokes the imagination, right? So I'll just read a little bit from the very beginning of the book. A sharp, cracking, cold day, the air of the Upper East Side full of rising plumes of smoke from furnaces and steaming laundries, exhaust from the tailpipes of idling taxis, flapping banners, gangs of pigeons. Here on the museum steps a flock suddenly chooses to take flight, the sound of their ascent like no other except maybe the rush of air a gas stove makes when the oven suddenly ignites. Only with the birds, that sudden suck of air is followed by a rhythmic hurry of wings that trails away almost immediately as the flock moves into the air. Their ascent echoes back from the solidity of the museum's columns and heavy doors, the wide stairway where even in the cold people are smoking and shifting their chilly weight from side to side, eating pretzels, hunching over blue and white paper cups of coffee. I have a backache. I'm travel weary, and it couldn't matter less, for this whole scene, the crowd and hustle on the museum steps which seem alive all day with commerce and hurry, with gatherings and departures, is suffused for me with warmth, because I have fallen in love with a painting. Though that phrase doesn't seem to suffice, not really. Rather, it that I have been drawn into the orbit of a painting. I have allowed myself to be pulled into its sphere by casual attraction, deepening to something more compelling. I have felt the energy and life of the painting's will. I have been held there instructed. And the overall effect, the result of looking and looking into its brimming surface as long as I could look, is love, by which I mean a sense of tenderness toward experience, of being held within an intimacy with the things of the world. That sense has remained with me as I moved out through the dark stone lobby of the museum, with its huge vase of flowers looming over the information desk in the center of the room, and out into the sudden winter brightness, the gray brightness of Manhattan in January, onto the museum steps. There, stepping outside into day, where nothing is framed or bounded, as things in the museum are, suddenly the sense of intimacy and connection I've been feeling flares out, as if my painting had been a hearth, a heated and glowing place deep in the museum interior, and I'd carried the warmth of it with me out into the morning. Is it morning still? The sky's a huge crystal, cracked and alive with fractures, contrails, cloudy patches, huge distances. But nothing seems truly remote to me, no chill too intractable, because I have stepped from a warm suspension out into the shatteringly cold air. Something of that suspension remains within me or around me. It is the medium in which I and my fellow citizens move. We are all moving just now, in the light that has come toward me through a canvas the size of a school notebook. We are all walking in the light of a wedge of lemon, 4 oysters, a half glass of wine, a cluster of green grapes with a few curling leaves still attached to their stem. This light is enough to reveal us as we are, bound together in the warmth and good light of habitation, in the good and fleshly aliveness of us. So he's talking about a painting. I don't know the way of pronouncing this name correctly, but probably Jan Davids de Heem. It was painted in Antwerp 350 years prior to the published date of this book. It's called Still Life with Oysters and Lemon. And it was in a glass case at the Metropolitan, lying flat, so that one bends and looks down into its bronzy autumnal atmosphere. And it changed his life, that one painting, right? He looked at it and he ended up writing a book about it. But this book is about a lot more than that. It's about him, his experience of art, about that painting, a relationship he had been in. It all melds together, right? Because it becomes part of his mind. When he experiences it, it reflects on emotion and imagination. Reflections bounce off each other in the mind. It's integrated into who he is. And that's how we experience everything, I think. There is no separation. There are these waves, us. They bump into each other, they jostle, they influence each other. There are ripples and eddies. There are things going on underneath the surface. We're all interacting constantly. And if the poetry as experience, poetry as a state of becoming, that's what that is. That's just a reframing of sublime or the conception of the all, right? Inextricability of interconnectedness, right? That's how I think, in my conception, the world works. But it's an interesting idea to think that that could be called poetry, and that the poetry of life is all around us and always occurring. It's occurring right now. But what we're now missing is more of these people to act as scribes of that experience. And do we need scribes of that experience? Because surely what a scribe of that experience, a poet, would do is write down some of these things and then translate that experience to others as they experience it. So it becomes part of that networked interconnectedness. Anyway, that's my musings. That's the Delve, episode 1, Poetry as a State of Becoming. I've got other things. I won't go into too much detail. I think I might just leave it there. and hopefully people enjoyed. I don't know what the next episode will be. I've got a few ideas. Got ideas about Texans, about creativity, about dialectical monism in more detail, about myself, and about a series of videos that are very strange uh, and very interesting that I enjoy a lot. So that's it for me, and that's the end of the delve. Thanks for listening.